Hello everybody, welcome to the RSK Biocensus for Thursday Club in March in a what feels like an emerging spring and a hopeful future. Today we're going to be hearing from Paola Reason, who's going to be talking about bats, and the title is Not Just a Matter of Winging It. I'm going to do some housekeeping and then I will talk to you about Paola, introduce Paola. I think a lot of you on this call have been here before, so you'll remember we do, but just for those of you who don't, we'll mute all the microphones, and there is a question and sort of box where you can pose questions to the panel at the side there, and I will be monitoring these throughout Paola's talk. At the end, we will have a Q&A session, so please, as Paola's talking, feel free to pop those questions in the box, and then we'll hopefully get around to most of them, if not all of them, at the end. After this session's finished, it will be recorded and available, of course, but we'll also send out a questionnaire for feedback on the first Thursday clubs, and so we'd really appreciate your time to fill that in if you could. So, Paola, our talker today. Paola's been an ecological consultant for more than 25 years. She spent most of these at one company before joining RSK Biocensus in 2019, along with some of her colleagues. Whilst at Bristol University as a postgrad, she started working with fruit bats in the Comores Islands, and perhaps not coincidentally, along with other current members of RSK Biocensus. You can see the descendants of these impressive Livingstone's flying foxes at Durrell and Bristol zoos. Paola is a chartered ecologist and a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management, a member of the Natural England's Bat Expert Panel. She's on the technical review board for the Bat Survey Guidelines and has been burning the midnight oil as part of the authorship team of the forthcoming revised Bat Mitigation Guidelines. And these will be the first ones in 17 years, and I think she probably mentioned that in her talk now. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Paola.
Hi everyone. I just need to warn you that there's a little bit of delay on my system because of my broadband connection, so hopefully we'll be all right, but my slides and my explanations may be slightly out of sync, but they will catch up. So the plan for today, we've got quite a lot of different people on the call, different types of people, so I thought we would start with a quiz because everyone loves a quiz, and meet the bats. Some of you will know all about that part and others won't. Then I want to talk a little bit about myths, threats and the protection that bats have, a little bit about their ecology and behaviour. Then I'll talk about the survey methods that are available to us now. I'll introduce a valuation process, talk through impacts and then mitigation, and then working with contractors. And then because monitoring is so important, I will be focusing on that. So here's the quiz. I could have done this as a poll, but we don't have much time. So you just need to scribble down the answers and then I will tell you if you were right or not. So some bats migrate. The furthest a species that lives in the UK is known to migrate is 20 kilometres, 200 kilometres or 2,000 kilometres. And then question 2. Most of you will know, probably everyone will know, that we have more than one species of bat in the UK, but is it 6 species, 12 species or 18 species? And then looking at the size of our bats, our smallest species weigh, is it the same as 1 or 2 teaspoons of sugar, same as a medium fig, or the same as a baby guinea pig? So around 10 grams or less, 40 to 50 grams or 100 grams. That's our smallest species in the UK. And then finally, what do bats in the UK eat? Is it only things like beetles, flies and spiders? Is it insects, fruit and blood? Or is it insects, blood, fruit, pollen, nectar, fish, frogs, lizards, small birds and other bats? Now, with no more ado, since you probably either knew the answers or had no idea, I'm going to skip on to the answers. So, answering question 1 and question 2 together, Nethusius pipistrelle is a European bat that flies the longest distances, and it's tiny, usually less than 10 grams, which I think is amazing. It goes all the way from Latvia to Spain, and while that journey clearly didn't go through the UK, our UK migrants have also been recorded going well over 1,000 kilometers, 1,400 kilometers. So I think that is pretty astonishing. And then most of you probably know that all our UK bats are insectivorous, but globally bats really do eat all of those things that are in the top of the slide, the insects, the blood, the fish, the frogs, the lizards, the small birds and other bats, which again is pretty amazing and pretty diverse. So they're a pretty diverse group. Even our UK bats, which are all insectivorous, do this in different ways. So some take their food from the air, others take them directly from leaves or the ground, or even from the surface of water, gaffing them off. And then the third question I'll come back to, how many species do we have? We have 18 species, and you get an extra point, and points don't mean prizes in this circumstance. 17 of these breeding. I wanted to bring these facts up because I think it's really amazing how our knowledge has advanced and also how much we don't know. So when I started work in the 1990s, I knew that whiskered and Brandt's bats were only separated into species in the 1970s, which I thought was pretty phenomenal, really, because they're mammals and we tend to know more about mammals. But then common and soprano pipistrelles were only separated into species in the 1990s, just as I was starting to get into bat work. And then Nethusiast pipistrelle, the species I was talking about in the previous slide, was only confirmed to be breeding rather than just a migrant in 1997, although to be fair, not many of them seem to breed over here. And then just when we thought we could relax, Alcathoe bat was discovered in the UK in 2010, and that's one of the whiskered Brandt's group, so they're all pretty similar. And I wanted to shout out for the one greater mouse-eared bat who was declared extinct in 1990, but started turning up in 2002 as a juvenile and has been coming ever since. I'm afraid he has no mates, either figuratively or literally. So I've put up the 18 species in their species groups, so they're genera. At the top, we've got the greater and lesser horseshoe bats, which seem to be doing quite well. Then we've got a little group of what we call myotis bats, of which the greater mouse-eared is one. Then we have nocturnal and Lysa's bats, nice long narrow wings, fly up high up in the open. We've got the pipistrelles that I've talked about. Common and soprano are the most common species you'll come across. Nethusiast, as I've said, pretty rare in comparison. We've got a couple of oddities, serotine and barbastelle. That's a photograph of a barbastelle. And then we've got brown and grey long-eared bats, which are, although they're in the same bracket, are really quite different. So brown long-eared bats are the ones which people are most likely to come across after pipistrelles, and they tend to share people's houses. Grey long-eared bats also share people's houses, but is our rarest species. And here you can see, when the picture comes up, the distribution of grey long-eared bats very much restricted to the south coast. The take-home message is the south and southwest have almost all the species that we know of in the UK, but you get fewer and fewer the further north you go. So the species that will affect your project depend on where you are in the country. As we said, the grey long-eared bat, very southerly distribution, maybe only 1,000 individuals. Our next rarest species, Beckstein's bat, you might have come across if you're working on HS2, so that's a fairly prominent constraint. Again, we don't have very many Becksteins. The protection assigned to them, different species reflect their rarity across Europe. And the reason we're getting to know more about our species, and which we have, and the reason they're becoming separated is partly because of advances in technology, and partly because of genuine range shifts due to climate change. I wanted to touch on myths, since myths feed into people's perceptions, particularly on site. So I have to tell you that bats are not blind. They can see as well as humans, even though they have tiny eyes in many cases, but they use echolocation to build up a sound picture, which is 1,000 times more efficient than anything we've ever built. And it gives them an amazing picture of their surroundings. Some bats, our Natura's bat, for example, can pick spiders off webs. I wasn't brave enough to link to a video, but if you type Natura's bat and spiders into YouTube, you will see an amazing bit of footage. The Brazilian free-tailed bat can fly at 160 kilometers an hour, which is faster than any bird. So that is pretty amazing, I think. So they're not going to get stuck in your hair. They don't all carry rabies, although some bats in the UK carry a rabies type virus called European bat virus. Obviously, there's no risk if you don't handle bats, and it doesn't really appear in the bats which tend to be most commonly found in houses. They don't want your blood. In fact, there are only 3 vampire species out of all the species in the world, about 1,000 of them, a quarter of all mammal species, and there are none in the UK. And some people think that bats are ugly. I have to say some of them really are, but not all of them, and that's really not important. But there's my evidence. You can't tell me that's an ugly bat. So why do bats matter? In the United States, it's been calculated that they're responsible for pollinating over 300 fruits, and they have a really important pollination role globally. They also perform non-toxic pest control services. So another US department calculated that that was worth $3.7 billion to the economy, and maybe 10 times that. They're also indicators of a healthy ecosystem. Now, what do I mean by that? If you'll bear with me and think of the ecosystem as a rug, and imagine pulling threads out of that rug. It will still look like a rug for quite a while, but when you pick it up, it will fall apart. And I think that's what we're doing to our ecosystems. We're pulling out various components without understanding what we're doing, and they're not functioning as they should. If you have bats there, that's a pretty good indicator that you've got a healthy ecosystem. And as humans, that's what we need. So moving on to some of the threats as well as the myths which have perhaps led to some persecution, and even now people ask for bats to be excluded from their houses. There was a history of major declines in the past, and things like timber treatments were responsible for killing lots and lots of bats. The other threats on the slide are more important these days. So loss of roost opportunities. Ironically, as we make our buildings more green and more sustainable and build them in that way and improve insulation, we end up with loft spaces which are cooler than bats need, and we end up with houses that bats can't get into. So that's really important all the way through Europe, in fact. Habitat loss and change, we obviously have a massive loss of natural habitat globally, but also in the UK. I think the State of Nature report said we were 160 something in the list of who's doing best to maintain their environment. We also have habitat change, so the use of pesticides, reducing insect biomass, making habitats less suitable, able to support fewer bats. Then there's artificial light at night, which is growing at a phenomenal scale across the world, stops bats traveling through the landscape, and also affects things like their insect prey. So the effects on insects can be quite subtle. They might change the time that they emerge in the year, so the food isn't available when bats are there, or they might make them emerge when they're smaller, which means there isn't enough biomass for them to eat. Climate change can have similar effects, but also those cold and unpredictable springs are really, really bad for bats just as they're starting to breed. And generally, those changes in temperature as we go through the year make the season changes out of kilter with things that bats evolved to live with for millennia. Then finally, there's mortality. There's road mortality, predation from things like cats, and also things like wind turbines. You might be surprised to know that we don't actually know the population trends for most of our species. We've got an indication that most of them are stable and that horseshoes are doing quite well, but it's quite difficult to know. So as a result of the declines, particularly the historical declines, bats are highly protected under our domestic legislation. I'm not going to go into the legislation because there are differences between the 4 devolved administrations, and I don't want this talk to be England-centric. But in all of them, licenses are required to undertake work that would otherwise result in an offence. And the legislation is really important, and I think it's been really instrumental in protecting bats that share our buildings in particular, but it doesn't protect bats against all of these threats. I thought I'd just introduce the life cycle for those of you who weren't aware. Most of you will be, but at the moment, bats are hibernating. As the weather starts to warm up, as it's doing now, they come out and feed in warmer nights. Then the females start looking for places to breed, often going back to their familiar roosts. They start to give birth. They feed their young. The young gradually become independent. They start to fly and feed themselves. Then the mothers move on and they start storing fat for winter. The adults start mating, go through into where the temperatures are cooler and start going back into hibernation, and then we have the whole year. So It's complicated because bats are not in the same place all year round. Our roosts are protected even when bats are absent, and it crucially means that the surveys that you can do are seasonally constrained, so you can't always get an answer for your project immediately. It also means there are better times than others for doing certain works, and programs can get quite complicated. A little bit on ecological niches, what you might call lifestyles. Some species fly within or close to vegetation and relatively low down. Others, like the noctules and lizards I talked about, out in the open and relatively high up. Some bats are able to emerge in relatively light conditions, but others wait until dark. Those differences relate to their echolocation ability, so they might shout loudly but not see much detail, or they shout quite quietly but get a lot of detail over shorter distances. So as you might expect, those are the ones feeding close into vegetation. Some species use their echolocation to catch prey as well as navigate, but others use their large ears, like the long-eared I showed you earlier, to listen for the tiny rustling noises made by insect prey, which again, pretty phenomenal, I think. Overall, some are generalists, more tolerant of anthropogenic change and disturbance, but others have very specific requirements, and consequently, they are rarer. So the take-home message again from this is it's complicated. We can't really anymore talk about just bats. We need to think about what types of bats we're looking. For development, we almost always need to know what we're looking at. So survey designs. Excuse me. I sometimes think that people pick up the bat survey guidelines and they only read a couple of tables in those in that document, and they don't really think about all the other information that's in there. I'd love to do a poll to see if I could get an honest answer to that. But the important thing about surveys is that you need to design them to answer questions. So you need to think about your proposals and what the impacts of those proposals might be, find out what you need to know to assess and characterize the impacts, and then design your surveys to give you those answers. I'm not going to go into all the questions, don't panic. I'll just wait for the slides to catch up briefly. Right, survey methods. We have vastly more survey methods at our disposal than we did have when I started. So we often start by going into structures and buildings, looking for signs of bats. And now if we find any droppings, we can pick them up and send them for DNA analysis, which is fantastic. We can look at the outsides of buildings, which might tell us where bats would be coming in and out if they were present. We do a lot of dusk emergence and pre-dawn return surveys these days. That's good for counting numbers, but of course it's hard to see once it gets dark. And if you've got a complex structure, you might need a lot of people. We can use those for trees as well, though climbing inspections tend to be better. Then we have surveys to look for activity in the wider landscape, so we can do transects, which are walked by people with detectors. So that's quite good to get an overview of species, but not so good if you want quantitative comparisons between sites and seasons. Sort of been taken over a lot by static detectors that we bung out for several days. We can do that now because although they generate very high volumes of data, you can analyze those automatically with caveats, I would say, but they're quantitative. Those static detectors don't tell us the difference between a small number of bats circling around a particular detector foraging and lots of bats commuting past. So once you've got some static detectors, you need to look at your results on an ongoing basis through the season and maybe decide that you're going to do some vantage point surveys to see how many bats you're looking at and see what they're actually doing to ground truth that static data. Or you might do specific surveys to, when you find bats, to backtrack them back to their roosts, which is a little bit like hard work. The last two lines in this slide are the more expensive end of the process, but they do give you lots of good information. So trapping and radio tracking is expensive and invasive, but it's very informative for the number of bats that you have tagged. It doesn't tell you everything. It's a really good way of locating tree roosts because bats tend to switch. That's not easy to say. Roost switch between trees frequently. It's also good for calculating home ranges, how far those bats are going at different times of the year. Then we have infrared and thermal cameras. Infrared, really good to support human observers, particularly for emergent surveys. As I said, sometimes it can be hard to see when they come out after dark. And thermal, very good for giving you detail, very good for things like crossing points, where you might want to see what bats are doing. All this technology comes at a price, quite a hefty price, in fact. So the kit is expensive to buy. It's expensive to maintain. Things like microphones, which are left out in all weathers, need testing regularly and replacing regularly, and they're really quite expensive. Then you have the analysis costs. You have to sit through and analyze all your data. Could be very high volumes of data, particularly for video. There is software coming which will help us analyze infrared and thermal automatically, so you don't have to sit through it, but it's not quite here yet. And of course, then you have to pay for the cost of storing all that data, which could be quite significant. I didn't mention drones. Drones are useful for doing things like flying over derelict buildings, so you can see the condition of a roof. You obviously can't see inside it, but you can see the condition of a roof if a building is too derelict for you to go inside. So I talked about survey questions. Here's a completely mythical road that is going to be widened, and that's what those funny greeny blue blobs are, because I just covered up the road names because it's entirely irrelevant. I could have drawn it by hand if I had any competence as an artist, but I don't. So here we've got bat roosts. We know from all the project data that we've got bat roosts of different species on either side of the road, and we've got some radio tracking data there shown by the blue lines, which shows us that some bats cross the road that is to be widened. So if we wanted to take the project on a bit, we could do some more radio tracking to see what other bats are doing and what times of year they're doing it. We could put static detectors at regular intervals to see where there are hotspots of bat activity along the road, or we could use thermal imaging, which would tell us if and where bats are actually crossing and at what height. We might combine those, do static detectors initially to look for bat hotspots, and then put the thermal cameras there. So you need to think about your proposals and the impacts of those proposals, and then design your surveys accordingly. We don't just need to know what where the bats are and which bats we're looking at. We also need to know what they're doing and where they're doing it and how they're getting around. So we need to look at habitats they're using, and that's on a broad scale. And then we need to look at things like the current arrangement of vegetation and lighting close to roost entrances. I think we're pretty good at doing those two things. Not necessarily so good at collecting baseline data in relation to, say, temperature and humidity within the roost before anything happens to it. Lighting, baseline lighting, so that we know what lighting is there before we start adding lighting into the equation, and high frequency noise and vibration. We've got reasonable guidance, pretty good guidance now, comprehensive on bats and artificial lighting produced by BCT and ILP, which is excellent. We're not quite as advanced in relation to bats and noise, and there aren't very many things I could direct you to, but I did write an article with an acoustician in June 2020 and in practice. So do have a look at that if you think your project might have noise impacts. I wanted to talk briefly about valuation. The guidelines obviously haven't been released yet, so I haven't put all the details in here, but once you've got all your survey data, you need to value your receptors, i.e. your roosts and your foraging habitat. And the process we do that now was issued in an In Practice article in 2010, Ray al., which was supposed to be the starting point of a discussion, and has suddenly become common practice without question, and even adopted into license application forms, which is interesting. So we've come up with a different scenario, and this is the one for roosts. So across the top, we have roosts of different types, and then on the left, we have species in rarity. Now, the point of this is that the species in each category are determined by region. So although abundant and widespread is only applied to soprano and common pipistrelle across the board, the species in less abundant and rare change according to where you are in the country, according to whether you're in South and Southwest England, whether you're in Southeast England up to, say, the Wash, whether you're in Northern England, whether you're in Northern Ireland, or whether you're in Scotland. I would say it's not particularly good for Scotland because Scotland is so big and has such a wide differences in species distributions. Within the cells of that table, you will get a geographical valuation such as local, district, county, regional, national, as you might expect. And we apply this process also to habitats foraging and commuting habitat. And there's also a separate process for valuing your assemblage of bats. Lots of caveats, lots of modifying factors such as The species is on the edge of its range, but it's a good starting point, I think, and it's a level playing field for everyone to do the same thing. So I hope it will be adopted and accepted. Once you've valued your receptors, you need to think about impacts. We normally think about impacts on roosts, impacts on foraging and commuting habitats, and things like direct mortality. So fairly obviously, impacts on roosts could include loss or partial loss of a roost, so taking out a building or a tree. You might modify features such as re-roofing it. You might lose or change an access point or the way bats approach an access point, or you can disturb bats in their roosts with noise or lighting or human intrusion. Similar for impacts on foraging commuting habitats, they can be lost directly or they can be modified, so you might manage it differently so it doesn't produce as much insect biomass, you might light it so bats don't want to use it, and so on. And then of course there's disturbance to bats using those foraging and habitats and commuting routes. And then direct mortality and injury, I've already talked about predation from cats, which tends to be fairly localized but can happen, particularly if you've got large residential buildings, sets of buildings. We've got mortality from wind farms and also mortality from road and rail infrastructure. Once you've determined the what, you also need to think about the when, so not just construction and operation, but maybe pre-construction works, advanced works, and then also for some decommissioning impacts. Once you've got the what and the when, you need to look at the how and the where. So the SIEM's ECIA guidelines sets out clearly how to characterize an impact using those factors listed on the left-hand side of the slide, which I hope most of you are familiar with. You don't necessarily need to write every bat appraisal in the terms of an ECIA, but I still think that even for a small project, it's useful to think about the impacts in these sorts of ways, whether it's positive or negative, frequency, timing, that sort of thing. And then the where, bats are mobile species. So we can't usually just look inside the red line boundary. Bats, even in a single building project, need to get somewhere to be able to feed. So we need to think outside the red line boundary. BCT have produced something on core sustenance zones, looking at the areas around the roost which are important to that colony. The size of it differs between species. They've done a literature review to see how large those areas should be. I think it's a fairly good starting point for understanding the zone of influence of your project. So, bat mitigation guidelines. As we said at the beginning, the existing guidelines are 17 years old and very ripe for renewal. And that's coming pretty soon. So the guidance are, the 2004 guidance was fairly focused on roosts. So this will also look at impacts on foraging commuting habitat and disturbance, lighting and noise in particular. As I've said, it's including a method of valuing bat populations and habitat features. It's going to give guidance, expanding on what I've just talked about for assessing impacts on bats, guidance on mitigating licensable and non-licensable works. It's quite a bit on monitoring. It's also lots of signposts and links to published research and guidance, so we're not reinventing the wheel or rewriting other people's guidance. And we talk a little bit about net gain. Now, as I said, not quite here yet, but the intention is to complete our current review, to put it out in public as what we're calling a beta version and invite comments, not detailed editing, but inviting comment, and also asking people for case studies and photographs that might go with that. The other intention with this is that we will review it constantly, not constantly, regularly, more frequently than 17 years anyway, and it will only be an online version, so it will be readily updatable. Obviously, from everything that I've said up till now, you will appreciate that no one size fits all for mitigation. So some species are happy with really small constrained spaces to roost and others need big spaces. Some can creep through a small access like the photograph on the top, but others need to fly through a bigger access. Some species happily go through narrow underpasses under a road, others need much larger structures, and some, like the nocturnal lizards I talked about earlier, won't do it at all. Some are much more at risk of mortality from wind farms because of their flight height. So for developments, we almost always need to know what species we're dealing with. I'm only briefly going to talk about the mitigation hierarchy, since I think you all really know about this. So avoid to prevent an adverse effect occurring. If you still have adverse effects, you need to mitigate to reduce those adverse effects. If you can't reduce them and get rid of them all to the point at which they're no longer significant, you need to compensate, i.e. provide newly created or enhanced alternatives. If you're losing a roost, it's always compensation. And then we need to enhance. And certainly if you're a public body, you have a duty to enhance. But I would say you must always start with avoid. So University of Exeter and BCT have done some research on mitigation that has been put in the past, and they've got some key points of agreement. I'm only going to go through a few of them, but not surprisingly, retaining the roost in some form has a greater chance of success than if you trash it. And retaining the same access point is important. And I think that's partly because we don't really understand how bats find new roosts. We assume they do from time to time, but we don't know how they do it. And some species are more curious than others, and perhaps some colonies are larger than others, so you have more individuals out looking. Some species can be quite suspicious of new roost provision. Providing a range of microclimates, areas within the roost with different temperatures is beneficial, possibly going to be even more so with climate change in future. Providing additional perching places and crevices is beneficial. I did want to say that only bituminous roofing felt is considered safe to use in bat roosts, and also it's the only one that is licensable. There is a product, I think, called Bat Safe, but it isn't, and you won't get a license to use that. So be aware of that. There are lots of tests going on. These membranes are being improved and redeveloped and reconfigured, and there are tests going on onto new sorts of membranes, so that we may be in a better position to use those sorts of membranes in the future. You have to watch this space. And then finally, bat boxes are inappropriate substitutes for significant roosts in buildings, which I'm sure you're aware of. Also shouldn't be used to justify the removal of mature trees, which provide so much more than bat boxes ever could. A little bit about implementation, working with clients and contractors. It's very important that you have a collaborative approach, and you need to make sure, most critically, that your messages are getting through to the people who need to know, so that you're talking to them, sharing drawing with them, giving the information they need to cost up their project, to program their work so that things happen at the right time of year, so they understand the implications of restrictions, seasonal restrictions on program, but also things like where they can put their compounds, where they can store their materials. So have meetings or conference calls to explain what you're trying to achieve. Also, if you've got longer term requirements for habitat creation enhancement, make sure that everyone knows who's doing what. It's really hard once everyone's packed up and left site to keep that going. And then one thing that came out of the BCT study is that the more complicated the mitigation, the more likely it is to deviate from what was planned. So keep your eye on progress, make sure you take lots of photographs, and make comprehensive records. And then finally, what I wanted to say was, make sure your advice as a consultant is pragmatic and reasonable. Don't ask for the impossible. When you look at your advice as a whole, make sure you've given your client enough time to be able to do things. Don't put unreasonable restrictions on, or restrictions which would make things take 6 times as long when it might be better to do something quickly with a slightly increased amount of disturbance. So think very carefully about whether your advice is pragmatic. And now the rest of my talk is going to talk about monitoring, which you might find surprising, but that's because there is a consensus that monitoring is not always done, often not done well, and is often not reported even when the mitigation is successful, and certainly less so when it isn't. So there's going to be a much greater focus on post-development monitoring in the Bat Mitigation guidelines, and also for those of you who understand licensing, there will be a much greater focus in relation to the earned recognition system of licensing, where people's experience is taken into account. We want to see that as an experienced consultant, you are making sure that monitoring is happening. So 2 stages of post-development monitoring, making sure it's all implemented as stated, and testing its success and getting those results out there. Even if your scheme is very simple, it should be supported by a monitoring strategy. It could be really brief, but they should all have a monitoring strategy which should say who's doing it, who's responsible for it, who will be funded, how and when it's going to happen, how you're going to make sure you get access for monitoring all the way through, even when the contractors have left site and say started selling off properties within a development or buildings, how you're going to get that access maintained, how you're going to report it, how often, who to, and really importantly, who's responsible for any remedial measures that are required, even several years down the line, and once your monitoring shows that these are necessary. So the monitoring strategy should define its objectives. I'll talk about that in a minute. Define success for each objective, use proportionate methods to collect the data and analyze it, outline triggers for remedial action and decide what that action should be, and again, contribute to a wider understanding of the measures applied. That's really, really important, because if we don't know what we're doing right and wrong, we can't improve. And so we want to avoid conservation white elephants. We want to make sure that we don't mitigate in a way which isn't beneficial for bats. And we need to increase our understanding of the lessons learned from all of the projects. Between us, we implement a massive number of projects. So we should be able to, with good post-development monitoring, increase our understanding a little bit more consistently than we have in the past. So a few objectives. I wanted to explain how we set objectives and what we mean by success. In the past, I think we've been a little bit lax. So we might have built a compensation roost, we found a couple of droppings in it, and we've said, okay, bats have found it, it's probably successful. So that's okay, we can walk away, and we've done it. But I think that's only really okay if we've got a low value compensation roost. What we really need to do is set objectives which are relevant to the impacts. So if you had a low value roost, that top line where you only just checking that you've got evidence of occupation by bats is maybe enough, and you might not even have a trigger for remedial action, because there would be an element of chance to reoccupation, particularly if you've got a mobile day roost, say. However, if you've got a maternity roost, you want to make sure that it's being used by the same species of bats using the roost for the same function. So that's the sort of evidence you're looking for in the test, which is the middle column. And then you have a threshold, a trigger for remedial action. So first of all, everything is implemented and in place. That might be enough. But if everything isn't as it should be, that would be your trigger for remedial action. So you might need a second objective that goes with that, looking at whether you've got an acceptable range of temperatures in your maternity roost, because temperature is a really critical element of whether a maternity roost is successful or suitable. So you might put in temperature logger data and then check that you have got the right temperatures in your roof, and the trigger for remedial action would be, if you didn't, you would put in some amendments. Maybe you need to put in a hot box, for example. Briefly, on commuting routes, so we might have an objective that the commuting route or an alternative new commuting route is being used, and you want to make sure you observe bats using that commuting route. If it's really, really important, you might have a higher threat test that you've got a certain number of proportion of bats doing so within a specified range, say. If you find that bats aren't using it, you need to look for the reasons why. Is it, for example, is a commuting route disturbed? Has it been fragmented? Is it not being managed so that it actually functions as a commuting route, and so on? You might put an additional objective on that to say that light levels need to be acceptable on those retained commuting routes. So your test will be light levels, so you need to get another specialist involved. And if the light levels exceed what are specified in conditions, you might need to produce some remedial action. Then my last two examples, the top one is about habitat. So you might have created some habitat and you want to check that it's increasing in value to foraging bats. That's your objective. Your test would be habitat condition assessments, and then looking to see bat passes increasing over time. If it's a really, really valuable critical site, for example, it's quite close to a significant maternity roost and it's really important for the juvenile bats, you might want to look at increased biomass over time as well. If your habitat fails its condition assessments, it isn't developing as it should, then clearly that would be a trigger for remedial action and you would need to put management in place. If the habitat's doing okay, but the bat passes aren't increasing over time, there might be other reasons for that. So local trends in numbers, or that the roost is not supporting the same numbers as it did. And we had that on one of our projects where a tawny owl was picking off the less horseshoes, a bit unfortunate. And then my last example, this is providing a safe crossing point over some linear infrastructure. So you want to make sure bats are crossing safely, but your test is that enough bats are crossing the road safely, not that some bats are crossing safely. That's what we call a test for effectiveness. So to give you an example, there was a scheme in Wales where an underpass was fitted and grills were put on the underpass for human safety reasons. And bats were certainly observed going through those grills, and so everybody was happy. And then unfortunately, it turned out from some other monitoring that not enough of the bats were going through the grills, so some were deterred. When the grills were removed, a much higher proportion of bats went through that underpass safely. So the test there should have been effectiveness, not use, right from the start. So that's what I mean about setting your objectives carefully according to the impacts of your project and what you're trying to achieve. Set those out at the beginning, design your monitoring to reflect those objectives and make sure you can answer the questions and pick up triggers for remedial action. You might need other disciplines. You might need landscape architects and you might need lighting engineers in order to be able to test those objectives. So my take-home messages: you really need to think ahead, get your timing and planning right, because things take a long time. Licenses, for example, take a long time to compile, even longer to determine, and they're no longer free, and they need a planning consent. At the moment, licenses are taking about 60 working days to determine because Natural England are under such pressure. When you get to your surveys, don't just pick up the survey guidelines and look at table 7.1 or whatever it is. Make sure you think about the questions that your surveys need to answer and use proportionate methods to collect the data you need to answer those questions. Follow the mitigation hierarchy, focusing on avoid. When you get to the design and implementation stage, work as a collaborative team, and then finally ensure the monitoring is funded, completed, and reported. And then finally, almost, I wanted to talk to you about the importance of not relying on received wisdom, but evidence. So here is a tree, a pretty skinny tree, pretty exposed tree. And in the past, we would have said bats which hibernate need trees of a much more substantial stature to give enough protection from ambient temperatures. Well, that turns out not to be true. There's a skinny tree, and this was photographed a week or so ago, and there were 6 bats hibernating in this tree, clearly visible from the outside without an endoscope, only a few centimeters in. So let's have more evidence and less received wisdom, and we will all manage to improve our mitigation and outcomes for bats. And with that in mind, can I also ask that if you have been interested by any of this and think you have case studies which would fit into the bat mitigation guidelines and that you would like to share, then please do get in touch. And if you've already promised something and photographs to go with it, then again, please send those in. We're waiting. Thanks very much. That's me done.
Thank you very much, Paola. Yeah, a fascinating talk and a huge amount of detail. I'm sure everybody agrees. We've had quite a few questions come in. Before we do the Q&A, I should have said this at the start. I forgot that Paola's webcam isn't working, so that's why you can't see it. But she is there. I'm sure she's still there, and she'll be answering these questions.
I'm still here.
Okay. Right. So these ones. Well, I don't know if this is an easy one or not. When are the bat mitigation guidelines going to be published?
That isn't an easy question, because it's not just dependent on me or the other members of the steering group. We have to get buy-in from the SNCBs and their legal teams. It is currently, after a few torrid months, and there's a lot of burning midnight oil, it is currently in the process of being cleaned up. Then we hope to get it agreed and released as a beta version for people to comment on. So it will be up for a limited amount of time, and then we will publish it and draw a line in the sand, incorporating any case studies. I'm hopeful that lots of you are going to send to me with that address on the screen very soon. And then we will try and keep it under review whenever there's a significant change or we got a nice lot of information. Or a change in policy.
Ooh, well, who knows, maybe. Okay, next one. Can surveys be done all year round? I assume not, as they hibernate in the winter months.
You can do different sorts of surveys at different times of the year, but the peak survey season is when bats are active between April to October. But you could go out and assess your buildings in winter. You can plan and prepare your surveys outside of the survey season, obviously. But don't leave your data analysis all till winter, because if you don't do your data analysis as you're going along, you may miss something which needs you to change your approach. So really, really important to analyse your data month by month. That is always our aspiration, even if we don't quite manage it every month.
No, indeed. Okay, what's the most important things we can do to support our bat populations? Probably quite a broad question, but I guess there's probably some quick wins there.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think the move towards rewilding and regenerative farming is really important, because that's going to make our habitats less of a desert. Some of them look really quite green and natural, but they're not actually producing much insect biomass. So we need to think about the wider countryside, but we also need to support bats within properties. And one of the sayings I've come across doing the mitigation guidelines is it takes a village to raise bats, which means we need to retain opportunities for bats that we already have. We need to add additional roosting opportunities wherever we can. So, and if we can do that on a village scale, that would be fantastic.
Okay. The next one is something that comes up quite a lot in my experience as well, which is do bat surveys have to be done prior to obtaining planning consent, or can it be a condition of planning consent to be done prior to demolition to save abortive fees, or potentially having to do them again the following year if planning has been delayed?
The difficulty is that the planning authority need all the information which is material to making a decision. So if you can give them the material which is material to them making a decision, then maybe some surveys could be postponed, but you need to be able to demonstrate that you have enough of a handle on what's going on in order to determine when you can do those surveys. It's very unlikely normally in most circumstances that you would condition protected species surveys.
Okay, right. What is the best method for creating microclimates within a compensatory roost?
Good question, and there'll be some advice on that in the Bat Mitigation guidelines, but you could do it very simply with extra boards and things. One thing that and also at the more glamorous end of the spectrum, for things like lesser horseshoe bats, people tend to put in hot boxes so which collects the area at the top of the roof. Another way of making sure that you don't lose the heat you're collecting at the top of the roof is to make sure your access points aren't so far up that they're letting all the warm air out. And then another nice little trick that I picked up from the Devon Bat group is really cheap and really easy, and they've got a whole load of polystyrene fish boxes. They've stitched a load of greenhouse shading mesh in the bottom. They're sticking them up in roofs, so you get little clusters of different microclimates, and they are cheap as chips, and the bats love them. If I go back to this slide here, let's see, that one at the bottom there. They got about, that's a fiberglass plant pot with a bit of greenhouse mesh in the bottom of it, and there were about 80 bats in there. It's just astonishing. And then of course you can add a heater, but adding a heater has a lot of pros and cons, which we probably don't have time to go into, but there's lots of considerations around heating, which will be in the Bat Mitigation guidelines.
Okay, you mentioned bat licenses also need planning consent, which is fair enough.
Yeah.
I assume this is not the case if the works are permitted development.
They want to see that you've demonstrated that you've got consent for doing the work in whatever form it is. So you would have to demonstrate that you've got consent, that it is permitted development. That the license applications are very long and complicated, and you have to go into a lot of detail about the consents and permissions you have for the work.
Okay, there's loads of questions coming in. I should just say that if we don't get around to answering them all, then Paola probably will email people with a response. So don't, if your question doesn't come up, then we will get back to you. A couple more then, probably, I think, with the time we've got. When should we think about monitoring high frequency noise?
That is a really good question, and I don't have time to go into all of the parameters around that, but if you look at my June in practice article, you will give some little pointers. I think we're really, at the moment, we're talking about the bigger, longer term, higher profile projects where you can see that noise is likely to be an impact. If you think there's going to be a lot of noise on your project, especially during the construction phase, and we're normally talking about the construction phase, then you might need to get some noise modeling done and get some of that modeling done for high frequencies above 10 kilohertz. I don't think we're going to go down the route of doing it for very small developments, because a lot of the work for things like traffic and general construction noise is going to fit below the radar of what bats can hear. But I can't give you a definitive article, but if anyone wants to talk to me about a particular project, I'm very happy to talk to them about it.
Okay, well, I think we've got time for one more question. You sometimes hear about projects needing tree climbers. When are tree climbers needed, and are there any alternatives?
I think tree climbers are the best way of ascertaining what sort of what we call potential roost features you've got in a tree. The alternatives to that tend to be emergent surveys, which are very unsatisfactory because you often can't see within a woodland where a bat has come from. I think in the new survey guidance, we're going to be focusing much more on climbing inspections, and then if we're doing emergent surveys, we're going to be asking for those to be supported by infrared cameras, because they just provide so much more information. But I think our approach to tree surveys is on the cusp of shifting, but climbing inspections, I think, will be with us for a little while yet.
Okay, great. Thanks, Paola, and I think we'll draw it to a close there with the questions, and just thanks again for your talk today. Last thing for me to say is we'll be sending out that questionnaire, so please take time to fill that in. And just to say that the next First Thursday Club, we're going to keep them going, and the next one is on the 1st of April, so I'm hoping that Mark Davison, who's going to be giving it, is going to pack it full of jokes. His talk is Winds of Change, an aquatic ecologist's guide to round 4. I have no idea what that means, and no doubt some of you won't either, but we'll find out on April the 1st. But apart from that, hope you all have a good day, and we'll see you soon. Thank you very much.
Cheers.